Hello, everyone. Uh, Thank you so much for being here. I'm Vec Lewis. I'm speaking to you on Gadigal land, and today I'm going to be speaking about community-based research and the poetics of survivance, a term that comes from the Anishinaabe um, theorist and writer Cheryl Viseñor, from collective methods to personal narratives. I'd like to thank from the outset Michael, Supriya, and Nero for inviting me to be part of this workshop and this day hosted by the Powerful Stories Network, which does amazing work. I guess I'll get us started. This is the pretty much rundown of how I'll present a little bit from my own work and perspectives. I'll start off with an acknowledgement of country and locate my own voice, being trans, diasporic, and a survivor. I'll move to talking about community-based research as a form of relational praxis. I'll talk about how I learned from the context of Mexico about methods otherwise, especially with the collective Vida Plena Puebla in Puebla, Mexico. I'll move to how this also inspired the approaches to a project that I headed up and designed with a team of people on questions of diabetes health and management amongst migrants in Sydney's West. And I'll focus in particular on my side of the fieldwork, which was with Latin Americans, and draw out something of importance on Juan's participation in this process. I'll then move from what we conventionally think about as data to this process of poesis, particularly in narrative, and that could be in poetic narrative, it could be in prose, but as a mode itself of participatory and dialogic practice. In particular, I'll center a little bit on my work in the archives in relation to family history, um, foregrounding the ethics of memory work, what I call memory work. And I'll move then to my experiences of working with sister girls here in Sydney, and interrogating systems of harm and trying to foreground systems of care in the face of those harms. We'll then sort of turn our attention to one way of doing this work of repair through research and beyond the health clinic, that is through narrative medicine. And I'll close with some considerations on these methods as a form of poetics and for the sake of survivance. So this image may help to guide us, and it's an image that brings in different characteristics, which you'll also find traced out on the concepts, methods, otherwise handout that I'm giving you. I will come back to it, but it basically connects poetics of survivance to narrative therapy, decolonial praxis, the work of African American and trans scholars of color, such as Cameron Orchard-Rich and also Jose Esteban Munoz, decolonial feminism, healing justice. When it comes to community-based research, the place of participation and reciprocity, what I gleaned outside of a university environment from community-based research, the so-called diagnóstico participativo comunitario, community participatory diagnostics, and I'll also be delving into system harm and trauma and healing, particularly as regards to vulnerable communities who face complex trauma. But I want to do so in a counter-pathological way, looking at what healing practices are already there in communities, which also address systems of harm and failure, and ways to commit or recommit to this work without engendering re-traumatization. So let me begin by acknowledging the Gadigal people on whose unceded lands we meet today and where I live and work. I pay respect to elders past and present and emerging, as well as to the sister girls and brother boys whose survival and creativity continue to transform what care and kinship mean here. A little bit about my own context, experiences and relations. I was born in Wajik, Noongar Boodja in Gullamuru, one of six from the same mum and dad, and one of 12 if we include the greater number. I'm third generation Irish Anglo-Indian. I'm the only one to have gone right the way through to uni, even to the level of a PhD. Um, I come from an area where there's a high number of Noongar people in the community, but also South Asians, Burmese, and Anglo-Australian working class, as well as Filipinos. If we want to get dry and statistical, we can turn to the CBR index, which portrays us, that geography, as being severely disadvantaged. In particular, Armidale has that image or representation, especially through the media, is a source of crime, violence, and marginality. Now, it is true that there's a high incidence of interpersonal and family violence, and I myself am a survivor of those. So I think it's very important to separate out some of the stigma, for example, for those of us who grew up in Wajak Noongar Boodja, from the outer suburbs in a place like Armidale, from what are the real challenges of living in that part of country in the colonial, post-colonizing context. So having situated myself, I'd like to talk about what drove me a little bit to community-based research and how I understand it. I understand it as a relational praxis. It's not simply about participation, although that's important, but also about reciprocity. How knowledge can move back to where it came from, how the process itself can also be reparative. I understand community-based research, or CBR, as a practice of relation. So in that acknowledgement of country and tracing out a little bit about my own experiences and context, I'm trying to foreground as well that that's a community or set of communities that, while very stigmatized, do have relations, including for Noongar people with country. So one really decisive moment for me was learning from Latin America. I am someone located within Latin American studies, it's true, but I learned a lot more about community-based research and methodologies by being in the context of Puebla, Mexico. I had actually started and formulated an anti-violence project, particularly given the death of a community leader, a trans community leader in Puebla, which made headlines worldwide, Agnes Torres. Um, I set up a quite, I guess, ambitious project proposal and connected with different collectives. I began some of that work, but then I also found, to my delight, that there was already a great research project underway, admittedly not in the city of Puebla, but in a neighboring town called Tehuacan. And it's from the group Vida Plena Puebla that I began to understand that such a sensitive topic as violence, an ethically compromising topic as engaging people with experiences of violence in the trans community, required a different approach, not just your standard interviews, but instead adopting an approach that encouraged collective reflection amongst peers, highlighting as well strengths within community and paths to transformation, as well as understanding or seeking to understand and uncover culturally specific notions of the manifestations and responses to violence. Participatory community diagnosis is the model that they were using, and it has a long history in Latin America, but it encourages participants to become co-analysts of their experiences rather than just subjects, research subjects. As an approach, it draws from participatory action research, and here where it would foreground the Colombian Orlando Falsborda and how he developed that, as well as the critical pedagogy and community popular education inspired by thinkers such as Paulo Freire from Brazil. In their work, in Vida Plena Puebla's work, they achieved what I couldn't, and they did so by seeing research as collective forms of reflection and paths to self-determination for community. That experience taught me humility, that the most transformative methodologies often live outside of the university, the living pedagogies of community. These were the research resonances for me, and they really enabled, given the fact that I didn't originally come from the university and was never destined to end up to being a university student, given my background, the value of going back to community. Now, in regard to migration and diabetes, particularly as through the lens of masculinity and the story of men, such as one, well, years later in Western Sydney, I drew on these methods contained with participatory community or community participatory diagnosis, namely PLA, participatory action tools for action, in a project on diabetes care amongst Arab, Chinese, and Latin American migrants in Sydney's West. We use lifelines, body maps, and health journeys. These are tools that come from PLA and that let people visualize their stories across time, body, and migration process. They produced within workshops artifacts that then that enable them to lead the workshops and talk about each element therein. Now, out of this process, I can draw attention to one's experience. One was someone himself who had found life incredibly constraining during the period of Pinochet's coup, and who already worked in community and was trained in popular education and was a man of the church. But by the time I meet him in this workshop context down in Bonnyrigg, he's in his 50s. And through the PLA tools, he mapped his own experience of illness, challenges of work, the long shifts that he had to endure as a worker over his lifeline, the dietary adjustments, and also the problematic bureaucratic encounters he had within health and support services. Through his drawings and reflections, a complex story emerged, one about masculinity, migration, and constant waiting. He said, I used to feel like a man with strength. Now I feel like a man, the system keeps waiting. What surfaced from this approach using PLA were not just biomedical facts, but textures of shame, endurance, and quiet repair. Insights that would never appear in a standard health survey, especially the insights that arose that really gave us a view into how diabetes care rubs up against and is complicated by mental health struggles. The process itself became a kind of narrative medicine, and I'll turn to this idea of narrative medicine soon. Attention, representation, and affiliation, listening, witnessing, and relating. And it was really important as well, even for the unstructured interview process, to be engaged in that form of listening. Indeed, with one, I started off with lines from a poem, which were all about loss. And then he talked about loss. Yeah. So mental health is just so important. And these approaches gave us some real insights. Now, speaking of poetry, moving from what gets conceived in traditional research as mere data to poiesis, something more generative and actually quite creative. Well, after several years of trying to use different community-based methods in my work, I've found myself returning to my own writing praxis and increasingly found that this itself is a form of research, even if it's expressed in lyric mode or auto-fictional modes. Um, and I've been doing it for decades without even realizing how this forms part of doing methods otherwise. A dialogic practice, sometimes speaking with ancestors, actually. So I have a novella that's called Chiaroscuro, which I wrote when I was an undergrad student in a flat from my kitchen, and also over several decades, excuse me, a series of poems which have come under the title of Stone Bitter Stories. Latterly, I've begun to delve much more, especially since my mother's death, into explorations of Anglo-Indian inheritances, as well as tracking or tracing the systems of harm that have shaped ancestral lives through the colonial archive, through the realities of family trauma, silences around abuse in family, and also the impact of migration and identity in a new context as we were colonial transplants from one context, colonized by the British to another. So over time, I realized that my creative and autobiographical writing, which I was just kind of doing on the side, including more recently the manuscript loop Vertigo, and you can see a visual representation of elements that are tracked out there, archive and counter archive from the book Loop Vertigo, that I'd been working towards the same end, whether in poetry or prose. I'd been kind of engaged in what Sadia Hartman calls critical fabulation to fill in all those missing elements and account for the contours of intergenerational trauma, awkward inheritances, to interrogate as well the archive. And none of this is just personal. It's a counter archive historical document. You can see the Kidapur Military Orphanage School, which is kind of where everything started for that side of the family, from my mum's great grandfather. I also try to restore women's voices that aren't in the archive. And I do this in different ways, but like this is through principally the poetic manuscript, Loop Vertigo. So family archives and the ethics of memory work. I'm including this lovely photo from Kings Park, look, 1945, and it features my uncle Hugh, his wife Connie, and his two children, Alan and Claire. Obviously, Claire's a girl there, but she's been a real important informant, to put it that way, in my family and archival research. She's made disclosures and made available an abundance of realia and letters, objects, and so on that were part of the family archive, and also spoken to realities and truths that were not necessarily evenly communicated within family. But I include a photo of her there as a young girl. She's still with us. She would be verging on 90 by now. And she remembers her brother in particular, Alan, fondly. She knows a lot about our family history, including her father being an Anglo-Indian man who only spoke Hindi when he arrived in Perth. So, with the process of doing this research, I did also engage with the official archive here based in West Bengal, given that everything started for us in Kidapur in West Kolkata. My turn to family and colonial history brought new challenges. how to engage the archive without reproducing its erasures and violences, and how to write from within family trauma without turning it into a spectacle. This, as I said before, has required some critical fabulation and also what I, even before I came across the term in Frigga Haug's work, have called memory work. In this sense, writing for me is a dialogic diagnosis of history, a way of making sense of intergenerational harm and legacies. So it was archival work that was also embodied return because I've been back to Kolkata several times since my mum's death. And through my mum's cousin Claire that you saw as a child on one of those earlier photos, I've also managed to secure copies of letters of Granny Una and also one of her daughters from the early days of migration to Australia. Archival return becomes then a form of counter genealogy, tracing how colonial systems of documentation and identification shape our lives and histories across generations in what I call colonial space-time. This has also required moving away from the formal archive, especially as it is dominated by administrators of colonial regimes and men in particular, to excavating letters from my great-grandmother, that is Una, my nana, and also my great-aunt Doris. Now, moving out of the family context into community context, and let's just say all these culminating experiences have informed my more recent work. Um, Being someone who's openly trans and has relations also in community, in particular with sister girls from pretty much early on in the 2000s. I made the acquaintance through a mutual friend of Rosalina Curtis. Uh, she's my main kind of mate, who's a sister girl. And she's one woman that had moved from Morris Soak, just outside Alice Springs. She's Arenda, I should say. Um, and she moved from the space of remote community and homeland to Sydney because of the need to seek medically supervised transition therapies. And this is a very common narrative thread for the lives of such sister girls. But they still maintain many links to their homelands as well, which is important to them for a number of reasons. And here you can see a photo of Rosa in the top right-hand side of the photo. She took the selfie, and that's me going like that. And then there's her sister Bree and the elder from Tiwi, Crystal Love, who's an amazing person, very deep thinker and doer. So, sister girls, their lives are marked by systemic violence, racism, transphobia, policing, incarceration, neglect within health and housing systems, including here in urban Sydney. Unfortunately, in engaging with social, legal, and health services, too often they're put in the basket of complex cases, and their needs are not so complex. They're actually quite common to a range of LGBTQ and Aboriginal Torres Strait Islander peoples, particularly those who've experienced displacement and trauma. But the systems that fail them are it's complex navigation. So apart from fighting for these basic needs and freedom from violence and harm, they also fight for country and homelands. And here we can see a panel that took place during one of the Sydney Biennales. Actually, that's where I met Crystal Love because she's an artist as well. They talked about the connections between defending country and also health, mental health in particular. And so they made some real, and also transition care, they made some real connections between the different kinds of violences that bridge body and land. And doing a lot more work with them now. So they fight also for country and homelands. So coming towards the end, we're talking about dialogical ethics, aren't we? In this context, community-based research means solidarity, accompaniment, and care. With Sister Girls, we draw on yarning and trust-based storytelling, which I connect to Ada in Bengali culture, a collective unscripted dialogue. Being of Irish Bengali heritage, Ada is also the way I tend to think and talk. It's what I grew up with. I grew up with a huge, sprawling, diasporic family, and the way in which we have always dialogued involves associative leaps, humor, metaphors, rhetorical clarity, passion. The way my mum thought and spoke was also like this and kind of demonstrated moving between worlds. This way of thinking was not so strange. I realized when I revisited Kolkata, and my mum would be right at home there. I want to actually briefly mention acuerpamiento as part of these sorts of ways of doing community-based research, which is not just research, but also involves care, acts of care, and foregrounds healing justice. So acuerpamiento, acuerpamiento and bringing together the solidarity and mutual work resonates with this and with healing justice principles that we must identify systems of harm, not the individual as the site of some kind of pathology, but that we also bear a responsibility then as well to people's mental health and care. So I am inspired by work that permits survivance through systems. And you can see there a few diagrams that unmap, I guess, what healing justice involves. And it's inspired by the work of Cara Page and Erica Woodland. It's Black, feminist, and queer community organizing against systems and for healing. And the images come from Healing Justice Lineages, which is a book co-authored by them. So really we're talking about in community-based research, and also in my own autofiction and poetry, spaces of narrative repair. The aim is to collect stories, but not just collect stories, but to create spaces of narrative repair where people can tell their truths in cultural safety and, to use the Spanish social movement's term, dignidad, dignity. This means seeing where our stories overlap, right? And finding threads. What unites all of these threads from one story to my poetry, from Sister Girls Yarning, which unfolds in multiple spaces, and real time to archival writing, is a practice of narrative medicine. The socially embedded relations of care outside of many institutional spaces. In Rita Caron's terms, this requires attention, deep listening, which is also a very important Indigenous concept, attuning to what is said and unsaid in our spaces. Co-presence, yeah. Representation becomes storytelling through words, image, movement, and the silences as well. Recognition of grief and loss. Affirmation becomes a relational solidarity forged through shared vulnerability. So using a decolonial and trans lens, it's for all the way, nothing about us, without us. In this work, narrative medicine meets community-based research through a decolonial and trans lens, not the healing of the isolated self, but the restoration of connection across bodies, histories, systems, spaces. I would also say that I've been very inspired by the work of Devanuj Gupta in this regard, who works with LGBTQI refugees across different borders and has developed, all sorts of artistic approaches, including the making of zines and graphic representations of people's stories. So fundamentally, this for all the we in all of our diversity, nothing about us without us, means making meaning together, whether that be through the work that inspired me from Mexican collectors, to what I put in place through the Western Sydney workshops, from my own poetic work to my work as a peer supporter as well. The question remains the same. How do we make meaning after harms, and how do we work towards healing? The last word, community-based research can be then seen as exactly that, the form of creation, poiesis, and the poetic. For me, it's not just methodological, it's also poetic. It asks us to dwell in the messy, the unfinished, maybe even the terrible the intersubjective. It invites us to also interrogate our positions of power clearly and mitigate against domination, and foreground care and storytelling as ways or roads to justice. Stories become foundations for care. As a trans diasporic survivor researcher, I hold on to this. The stories we tell, some of them, yes, like my collection implies, are stone bitter. And the ways we listen themselves can be the foundation for infrastructures of care, finding ways to create these webs. They can build relation where institutions have failed. They can name harm and they can imagine otherwise. So thank you very much. I'll leave that Poetics of Survivance diagram up there again and its various branches. Dhanyavad, Dhanyavad, gracias.